Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It begins with a photograph. Grainy, black and white, taken in the late 1940s somewhere in the forgotten backwoods of Appalachia. At first glance it looks like any old family portrait, weathered barn wood behind them, faces stiff and unsmiling. But stare long enough, and something begins to feel wrong. The young woman clutching the infant has eyes too hollow, too wide, as if she knows a secret the camera is not supposed to reveal. And the child in her arms, well, some say the child is not just her son, he is her brother. This story is not a folk tale, not a myth whispered to scare children. It is a real chapter in America's hidden history. One that officials, neighbors, even relatives tried desperately to erase. What you're about to hear has been buried in court records, in sealed medical notes, in old boxes of family photographs left to rot in abandoned homes. It is the kind of story people don't want told, because once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The woman's name, for the sake of those still alive, has been changed. We'll call her Mary. Mary grew up in a world where isolation meant survival. Her family lived so far from town that outsiders rarely visited. Poverty was not just an inconvenience, it was the air they breathed. Schooling was scarce, opportunities non-existent, and rules of society blurred in the shadows of desperation. In these valleys, bloodlines bent inward. Marriages weren't chosen from love, but from proximity. Families remained families, even when the lines between cousin, uncle, or sibling began to disappear. Mary was just a teenager when whispers began about her father's interest in her. Neighbors turned a blind eye behind. Cause to acknowledge it was to admit the sickness that thrived in the hills. By the time she was 16, her stomach had begun to swell. There was no husband. There was no wedding. Only silence, shame, and the slow acceptance that the community around her would protect the abuser, not the abused. When she gave birth, the child's existence raised questions no one dared ask. How could the boy be both her son and her brother? What kind of place allowed this to happen in plain sight? This is the story America was never meant to remember. The truth of Mary's family begins long before her birth. Generations earlier, the land itself had conspired to trap them in isolation. The mountains of Appalachia created walls of stone and forest, barriers that cut families off from the world beyond. Roads were poor, money was scarce, and survival often depended on sticking together, sometimes too closely together. In those days, marriage outside the family was rare, not because of choice, but because there was simply no one else. By the early 1900s, the bloodline was already fragile. Children born with strange features, crossed eyes, or slowed speech were quietly explained away as accidents of nature. But those who lived nearby knew better. They whispered that the family's roots twisted inward, feeding on themselves like a snake devouring its own tail. And the worst part? No one intervened. Authorities dismissed rumors as gossip, doctors avoided the hills altogether, and neighbors convinced themselves it was none of their business. Mary was born into this silence. Her mother was already a shadow of a woman carrying the weight of her own scars, the kind you can't see on skin, but only in the way she avoided mirrors. Her father, an imposing, grim figure, ruled the home with a mix of fear and necessity. He provided, but at a terrible cost. In a world where hunger and cold were constant, his power became absolute. The cycle tightened its grip with each passing year. By the time Mary was 12, she was no longer treated as a child. She was a possession, a secret kept behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Neighbors might have heard muffled cries or noticed how Mary never played with others, how her gaze lingered on the ground whenever strangers passed. But in small towns, silence is safer than truth. When Mary became pregnant, her family concocted a story that would hold just enough weight to be believed. They told outsiders that she had been taken advantage of by a distant cousin, someone passing through, someone who couldn't be found to answer for it. But those close enough to see the way her father's hand lingered on her shoulder, the way she flinched when he entered the room, they knew. They always knew. And yet, no one spoke. Because in these forgotten corners of America, shame was a stronger chain than justice. The child born from this silence would carry the proof in his very body, a living testament to generations of buried sins. When the baby came into the world, the midwife hesitated before handing him over. His cry was faint, his breathing shallow. His face, though small and new, already bore marks of a bloodline too tightly wound. One eye sat lower than the other, his jaw underdeveloped, his limbs thinner than they should have been. To an outsider, these would be signs of trouble, but to Mary's family, it was nothing new. They had seen this before. They had lived with it. Mary clutched the child as though protecting him from the very world that would judge his existence. To her, he was not a medical oddity, not a scandal in flesh. He was simply hers. And yet, beneath that instinctive love, she knew the horror. This child was also her brother, born of the same man who had fathered her and now fathered him again. One man, two children, bound in a circle that defied every law of nature and morality. The whispers began immediately. Neighbors asked careful questions, though never directly. Some said the child wouldn't live long, that children like him never did. Others, with a crueler edge, suggested it might be better if he didn't. But Mary refused to let go. She fed him, rocked him, kept him warm through the brutal winters. Each day, his survival was both a triumph and a curse. What few outsiders dared to visit the home left with uneasy stomachs. They spoke of the eerie quiet in the house, the way Mary's father watched them with a cold suspicion, as though daring anyone to interfere. The baby, meanwhile, grew into the role forced upon him, fragile but stubbornly alive. Doctors were never called. Schools would never welcome him. Official records, if they existed at all, were deliberately vague. His name was written, but his parentage, his true parentage, remained blank or disguised. The family did what it always did. It buried the truth under silence. But in small towns, secrets have a way of rotting. And soon, the whispers became louder. Some spoke of curses, others of divine punishment. A child who was his own uncle, a boy who was both brother and son. The story spread beyond the valley, carried by rumor into towns that wanted nothing to do with it. Mary had not just given birth, she had unleashed a living reminder of everything this country prefers not to see. As the boy grew, so too did the unease that surrounded him. Childhood should have been a time of innocence, of running barefoot through fields and laughing with friends. But his world was different. Other children avoided him, their parents pulling them away with whispers they thought he couldn't hear. "That's the strange boy," they muttered, "the one who shouldn't exist." He carried the marks of his bloodline in his body. His speech was slurred, his learning delayed, his movements awkward. Yet behind his mismatched eyes was a hunger to belong, to be seen as more than a secret. Mary did what she could, shielding him from the cruelest stares, teaching him words when schools would not, songs when churches turned them away. She loved him, yes, but that love came wrapped in guilt. For every moment she looked into his face, she saw both her son and her brother staring back. Her father, the architect of this twisted legacy, never spoke of the boy beyond what was necessary. To him, the child was neither miracle nor mistake. He was simply another possession, another reminder that his control over the family was absolute. He demanded silence about the past and obedience in the present. The boy grew up under that shadow, never knowing the full truth of his origins, though perhaps sensing it in the way people recoiled from him. Neighbors tried to forget. They stopped asking questions, stopped visiting the house altogether. The family became like a ghost, present, but never acknowledged. In the records of the town, their name was rarely written, and when it was, it came with gaps and unanswered lines. But forgetting doesn't erase, it only delays. By the time the boy reached adolescence, his strangeness had become impossible to ignore. His features hardened into a mask of inbreeding, his mind struggling to keep pace with the world around him. Yet still, Mary defended him fiercely. She swore he was not a monster, not a curse, but deep down she knew the truth. He was living proof of everything unspeakable, and proof cannot remain hidden forever. Rumors began to attract attention beyond the hills. A traveling doctor, a curious journalist, a preacher determined to cleanse the valley. Each arrived with questions, with suspicions, each left more disturbed than before. The boy was no longer just Mary's secret. He was becoming America's forbidden story. The boy's existence could no longer be contained within the silence of the valley. By the 1960s, whispers had spread far enough that outsiders came searching, not out of compassion, but curiosity. The story of a child who was also his mother's brother had the power to shock, to horrify, to draw attention in ways the family had never faced before, and when curiosity collides with shame, the result is always fire. A journalist from a nearby city was the first to put words to paper. He described the family as living fossils of a darker America, people left behind by progress, trapped in cycles no one dared break. The article, never published widely, still circulated in private hands, its words dripping with both fascination and disgust. To outsiders, the boy became a symbol, not of poverty, not of abuse, but of something grotesque. Mary felt this weight more than anyone. She had loved her son fiercely, yet she knew she could not protect him from what he was born into. Each time she looked at him, she asked herself an impossible question. Was she saving him, or was she condemning him to a life of ridicule and misery? It was around this time that religion found its way back into the family. A preacher, shaken by the rumors, declared the boy proof of sin and judgment. He called him a child born of darkness. Townsfolk nodded quietly, glad to pin their unease on scripture rather than conscience. To them, it was easier to say the boy was cursed than to admit he was the product of silence, abuse, and neglect. Through all of this, the boy himself remained unaware of the full story. He knew he was different. He felt the stares, the cruelty, the distance people kept, but he did not know that his very blood was the reason. Mary kept that truth buried, hoping to spare him at least one layer of pain. Yet secrets always have a way of clawing to the surface. If you're still whining, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you speak the truth, or would you bury it, as Mary did? The world outside was changing rapidly, but in the valley, time stood still, and the boy, who was both son and brother, became a figure that haunted every outsider who dared look too closely. By the time the boy reached adulthood, the damage of his bloodline was written in every part of him. His body bore the deformities of generations turning inward, and his mind remained trapped in a fog of half-formed thoughts and childlike simplicity. He was no longer the infant hidden in Mary's arms. He was a grown man, and his presence could not be ignored. The town around him had moved forward. Roads were better, electricity hummed through the hills, and television sets flickered in homes where once only kerosene lamps glowed. But progress never touched Mary's house. To many they were relics of another age, figures out of time. And with each passing year, the boy became less a person and more a legend whispered about by those who never dared approach. Mary's love never faltered. She dressed him, fed him, and shielded him from the cruelty of strangers. But she also grew older, weaker. Her life had been consumed by a cycle she had never chosen, yet could never escape. She had given birth to her own brother, and now she carried the burden of protecting him from a world that saw him as something less than human. Some say government officials eventually heard the rumors that social workers or health inspectors made attempts to intervene. But in those days, intervention was half-hearted at best. Rural poverty was treated as an embarrassment to be ignored, not a wound to be healed. And so the boy remained where he had always been, in the shadows of the hills, hidden behind the walls of a decaying farmhouse, remembered only in hushed tones. The cruelty of history is that people like him are remembered not for who they were, but for what they represented. To outsiders, he was proof of inbreeding. Proof of what happens when blood turns inward and silence replaces justice. To his mother-sister, he was still just a child she could never let go of, a life born from violence but clung to with love. Yet even love has limits. With time, Mary began to understand what no mother ever wants to face. She would die one day, and when she did, the boy would be left alone in a world that feared and rejected him. It was this truth, more than the stares, more than the shame, that haunted her until the very end. Mary's final years were marked by silence. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she kept her eyes lowered, as if afraid that one glance might unleash the whispers she worked so hard to avoid. The boy, now a man, lingered at her side. He followed her with the obedience of a child, even though the world saw only a malformed figure with an unsettling presence. To those who caught glimpses of him on rare trips into town, it was like seeing a ghost, an echo of sins no one wanted to confront. When Mary passed, the house fell quiet in a way that could not be repaired. Without her, the fragile shield between the boy and the outside world shattered. Neighbors recalled hearing him cry out at night, wailing in confusion, unable to comprehend the absence of the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally. Some claimed he wandered the woods, aimless and frightened, muttering to himself in broken words. Others whispered that he was taken away, quietly, by officials who wanted to erase what he represented. No official record exists of his death. No gravestone marks his resting place. Like so many stories buried in America's forgotten corners, his life simply dissolved into rumor and silence. But the memory of him lingers, in faded photographs, in the stories passed down by those who lived near the valley, in the uneasy knowledge that such things did not happen in some distant land, but right here in America. To some, the tale is evidence of decay, of families trapped in poverty and isolation. To others, it is a mirror, forcing us to look at what happens when shame and silence are allowed to triumph over justice. Mary did not choose her fate, and neither did her son-brother. They were victims of a cycle that began long before them, a cycle written in hunger, fear, and the cruelty of secrecy. The story you've just heard is more than a grotesque tale. It is a reminder that history hides not just triumphs and heroes, but wounds, deep wounds festering in the dark, wounds that some families still carry, though they'll never admit it. And so the boy remains nameless, faceless, a ghost in the American past, not a monster, not a curse, just a human being born into a nightmare, forever remembered as the child who was both brother and son,